Hi everyone, this is really just a short introduction to just getting you to think about how to create a coherent plan for your dissertation. Unfortunately, all too often dissertations can be written in a way that is actually quite readable and quite good if you take each chapter separately, but actually when you read the whole piece there's no genuine clear narrative. And therefore, really, this is just an introduction to try and get you to think about the idea of creating narratives and ensuring that in planning and thinking about your research, you're actually creating something coherent. The example I'm going to use is the dissertation that you have a copy of online. So once you've watched this, if you want to go away and have a further look at that dissertation, to think about the level of coherence and the way that the narrative has been built within it, please do. But obviously, if you don't want to, you don't have to. This is really just to sort of get you thinking. To begin with, you'll sort of see down the left hand side, what I've done is try to give you sort of a very simple flow diagram of just some of the things to think about, and therefore to think about whether there's a flow in the way that you've actually developed your ideas. And the only bit of this presentation really which isn't about the example but is about your research is just to say that whenever you start doing some research, one of the things to perhaps begin to think about and to jot some ideas down around are these three areas here. What is your area of interest? So try to be quite specific, try to get some of your own context in there. So what is the area of interest? You can just say, oh, pedagogy, but obviously it's better to try and make it more focused. Also think about why this area is important to you. Why do you think this area needs researching? And certainly why do you think this area of research needs researching by you? And then finally perhaps think about the context of the study. What's the location that it's being carried out in? What are some of the contextual factors of the research sort of location that you're going to be looking at? And it's really just to get you to begin to think about your own positionality as a researcher, to begin to think about why this is important, and to begin to think about some of the contextual issues within which your research is embedded. Obviously, once we've done that, we then need to start thinking about what the focus is, and from the focus what the research questions might be. So for example, the example that you have in the dissertation that you've been given is that it is an investigation of teachers' perceptions of the effects of class size on teaching in primary schools in Al Afuf, Saudi Arabia. And therefore you've got quite a specific area of interest. And just one thing to think about is, if that's the general area, if that's the focus of the research, what do you think the research questions for this study might actually have been? There were three of them. If you want to try and guess before you have a look, just pause this video now, jot some ideas down, and then start to play again to see what the actual answers are. In the case of this study, these were the three questions that the students selected. So, do differences in class size impact upon classroom management? To what extent do teachers adopt varied teaching methods and approaches when working with small and large classes? And do differences in class size impact upon teachers' ways of assessing students' performances? So, given that the whole idea is to look at teacher perception and to think about their perceptions in relation to the effect of class size on teaching, the three elements of teaching that have been chosen are the teaching methods themselves, but also the classroom management and student behaviour, and the way that teaching and learning is assessed. So the three questions are quite specific, and they relate very directly to the main title. It's interesting that in some cases, within some dissertations, that clear link isn't necessarily there. Having decided upon the three research questions, what do you think might have been some of the main search terms, or what kind of areas do you think this student may have actually decided to include within their literature review? And again, if you want to jot some ideas as to what you think some of those headings might have been, then just pause the video now before carrying on. Okay, so this was actually what the literature review looked like. Basically the subheadings that we used within the literature review. So obviously a general introduction to the literature review, just general issues around class size, and then looking in more depth at class size and student achievement, class size and teaching methods and approaches, class size and classroom management of students' behaviour, and class size and assessment of students' performance. So you can actually map those various elements of the literature very clearly back to the three research questions. In other words, having decided on those three research questions, the student has then gone away and thought, well, okay, then if I'm interested in things like student behaviour, what evidence is there from past research? If I'm interested in teaching methods and teaching, if I'm interested in assessment, what kind of information can I find? So already there's a very clear narrative beginning to form from the title, through the research questions, and then into the literature review. So, moving on. We now have the title, the research questions, and the areas covered in the literature review. If this was the area that you were interested in, considering that we're looking specifically at teacher perception, what do you think the main methodology would be? What kind of methodological framework do you think might be most appropriate? And again, if you want to have a think about this before you actually look at the example or the actual answer given, please stop the video now. And here we go. He actually used a survey methodology, but within that used a mixed methods approach. So again, he's trying to look at overall perceptions and patterns of practitioners. So what he's actually done is decided he's going to use sort of fairly large scale research, and has done that through using a survey methodology, but within that a mixed methods approach. So now we need to think about, well, we've got the literature, we've got the methodology, what are the actual methods that were used? So, and also potentially what were the sample sizes? So again, thinking through, we've got the title, very clear link to research questions, very clear discussion about those research questions within the literature review, then considered that it would be most useful to use a survey methodology, but within that a mixed methods approach. What kind of methods are most likely going to have been used? And again, if you want to jot some ideas down before looking at what the answer is, then please pause the video. Okay, so what he actually did was predominantly to use a questionnaire. The questionnaire was completed with 90 people and was predominantly closed, but also used open questions as well to allow people to give more detailed, fuller responses. And then in addition to that, he also used just a couple of semi-structured interviews, so that effectively he was getting a very broad view through a survey method and backed up with a little bit of semi-structured interview. But again, it is a very clear flow of thought going through. It's not the only methodology that could have been used. It would have been perhaps just as easy to say that they were going to use a case study and that they were going to go down the route of looking at interviews and perhaps doing observations to see whether those perceptions met with the reality of the situation. So there's more than one way of doing this. What's important is that your thinking is clear and coherent, and that essentially you can make a good case for how the thing flows and fits together. So with that being the case, what kind of analysis did this student do? And again, stop if you're wanting to jot down some ideas. And in his case, because obviously he was looking predominantly at questionnaire data, he did some statistical analysis, so frequencies, percentages, cross-tabulation, means. He also used t-testing, and have a look at the dissertation if you want to see how that's been done. Within the open questions within the questionnaire, he predominantly looked at keywords in responses and did that in relation to sort of some of the themes that were coming out. And then from the very small amount of interview data he had, he also did some thematic coding to try to understand what kind of main arguments, etc., were coming up from the interviews that he did. One of the things you could argue is a restriction of this particular piece of work is that obviously with only 2 interviews, it's a very, very small sample to actually include as interview data. So what degree of validity is there? And that could be considered and questioned and thought about within the evaluation part of a conclusion. Also, having used percentages, there is a question mark over whether or not percentages are accurate ways of presenting data where you have relatively small samples. So with 90 teachers, less than 100 teachers, is it good to use percentages, or should you just use raw data? And that's an argument that is often had between researchers as to how many actual responses you need before you start using percentages. But what's important, and what I keep reiterating, and I hope that sort of if nothing else you might take the diagram on the left as being central to your developing thinking, is the whole idea of seeing a very clear flow and narrative as you move through the dissertation, from developing a focus and thinking about the context, to the research questions, to the literature, methodologies and methods and analysis. And in thinking about that flow, it then becomes important to try to attempt to have the same flow within your writing, so that the chapters actually flow one from the other, so that when whoever's reading it reads it, they actually read it as a single piece of work rather than a series of sort of hermetically sealed elements within the dissertation. Finally, you need to think about the ethics element of your work within the methodology, and therefore make sure that the ethical element of your dissertation isn't just something you see as a hurdle. It isn't just a case of, oh well, I have to get ethical approval, so once I've jumped that hurdle I don't need to worry about it anymore. What you need to do is to start thinking from very early on, when you're creating your research questions, when you're looking through the literature, what are some of the potential ethical issues with my research, and how will I ensure that my research is actually an ethical piece of research as I move through the research process. So see your ethics not as an endpoint. In a way, you know, putting it at the end of that flow is the wrong thing to do, but make sure that your ethics is something that is integrated into and infused across the whole process. It isn't just a case of getting a piece of paper to say that you're legally legitimate. So I hope this sort of just gets you thinking about how you're going to begin to plan and sketch out your dissertation work, And one of the things not to worry too much about is that as the work itself matures, you will change your ideas. You may actually be into the work as you're beginning to adapt things. That's perfectly fine, as long as you retain that level of coherence. And a good way of doing that is to ensure that you keep in contact with your tutor and don't leave things until the last minute, or don't keep running up against deadlines, because that's where the coherence begins to suffer. So good luck with your dissertation, and really look forward to reading the outcome of your work later on in the autumn.